4 key areas. We're going to talk a little bit about what it means to fail fast. We're going to talk about what a coding tester is, why that's important. Talk very briefly about testing continuously. What is testing continuously? Why is it important? And why do I need to now learn to test every step of the process instead of just wait for the developers to hand me the code? And what happens when you don't have a GUI you can rely on? So let's talk about some failures. Everybody remember the Zune? It's good stuff. So all jokes aside, failing is not necessarily always a bad thing. So really what does it mean to fail fast? Failing fast, especially as it relates to DevOps, means to get very, very quick feedback on what is broken about the product. What is one of the fastest ways to do that as a tester? Look at the user story. So many times I see testers wait until after the sprint planning is done and after they get their code to start looking for defects. What I found is one of the key areas where we found the biggest reduction in cycle times. Are you all familiar with the term cycle time? Yep, cool. If you're not, come find me. I'm happy to break that down for you a bit. One of the biggest key reductions in cycle time was we brought the QA up. We made them the owner of the sprint planning session. And we said, we want you to start trying to find bugs in the user stories. Because your QA team, they're really the SMEs. They're in the product more than the developers are. They're in the product almost more than the users are in most cases. We brought that knowledge up, and they started looking for bugs in the user stories and the way the user stories were written. They challenged the product team. They challenged the developers. They said, hey, this new functionality that you're adding, did you know that it's going to have this large impact on these other stories? And what we found that even before a single line of code was written, QA was already finding logic issues. They were finding bugs. And it caused us to be able to speed up our cycle, and we were finding less critical bugs in the end and more critical bugs in the very beginning. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't start looking at the code as well. One of the things I'm going to touch on a little bit later is QA needs to start looking under the hood of the code. They need to start learning some better technical skills to say, not only am I going to wait until the developer is done with his code to give it to me, but I'm going to go to the code review. I'm going to start looking at things. I'm going to start looking at logic and patterns to figure out, hey, maybe I need to start testing something a different way, or maybe we're going to introduce some logic errors with the way that this is written. The next thing, and perhaps another very critical piece, and this is one of the more important pieces, is if you forget everything that I say, hopefully you'll remember this part. Rapid prioritize feedback. I see so many times where the QA teams grow in technical skills but leave behind their communication skills. They don't take the time to learn how to communicate differently. Gone are the days where you can log a bug, assign it to a developer, hope that they can work on it, hope that they understand everything, and you wait a few days and get that feedback. When you're releasing multiple times per day, you can't assume that that's the case. You've got to learn to get up out of your chair, have a conversation, be able to clearly communicate what you're seeing, and that can be through screenshots and steps or whatever it might be, but you have to start having that communication. You have to have the communication with the product owner. The QA team can't be removed from the product team. They can't be removed from the developers, or even the manual and automated testers can't be removed from one another. One of the things that we're seeing, and this is something that a lot of enterprise companies are starting to take a look at, but definitely lagging a little bit behind, but with smaller organizations, this is something that's absolutely critical, is the QA team is now starting to own their test environments. It used to be the day of when you wanted a test environment, you put in a ticket you had to get it approved, and you had to figure out the cost. You had to put a ticket into IT, you would hope it get approved, implemented properly, and several weeks would go by, and then you probably didn't even need the environment anymore. So now with the advent of things like AWS, with GCE, with Docker, with the ability to have tools and technologies to spin up on demand, and with virtual environments as well, on-demand test environments, a QA team has to learn that technology. They can't be removed from their test environments. They have to understand what it takes to build a test environment, what goes into a test environment, and how to spin up one on demand. This is especially critical for automation teams as they're doing their work. And as Angie said yesterday as well, it was a fantastic talk. You must automate in sprints. The thought of your automation team being relegated to being regression testers needs to go away. that you need to rely on your automation team to be active in the sprint itself. I've got a good example of a previous place where I worked at. The automation team decided to create a mock environment to be able to test some of their own code. That mock environment became so popular that the developers stole it and started using it for their work. Now, if we had put those guys as a regression tester, your automation, so your regression, that would have never gotten done. And we would have never seen the efficiencies go through the entire process for that. And I'll touch on this a little bit more a little bit later. Coding tester. I do believe that every tester should learn how to code. I believe that. I don't believe that every tester needs to be an automated tester, or you must work in automation. But learning how to code can only improve your life as a tester. It cannot degrade it. It can only improve your life as a tester. I've given this previous presentation at Stack last year, so I'm going to breeze through this a little bit because I only have a little bit of time trying to compress a lot of information. If you're curious about this, please come and talk to me. I'm happy to meet with you or talk with you a little bit more in detail about the path that I've used. I trained an entire team up. We brought an entire team of manual testers up and taught them how to code. So I know it can be done. I took a guy with no high school education, no college education, and we taught him how to code enough to where he became an extremely efficient and engaged tester. And it really improved his life to where he was able to then move on and grow to the point where he thought he would never have those abilities. So I like to say that learning how to code is a lot like learning how to cook. Julia Child, so I'm not, for any of you who grew up in the South, probably grew up in the South watching her on PBS on the weekends, just fantastic. I don't know why my marketing team chose this picture, but I said learning how to code is a little bit intimidating, and they're like, all right, intimidating Julia Child picture from Google. It's like, okay, great. But it really is learning how to code. When you go to a restaurant and you order some food, you are completely reliant on that wait staff getting your order right. You're reliant on the cook to cook it right. You're reliant on the guy who's running the food to run it while it's hot and to make sure that it gets to your table in good enough time. It's much the same way when you're a tester and you don't know how to code. I am a tester and I need to be able to perform some actions. Say I need to test some complex regex. So in order to do that, I need to have some scripts. So I put in a ticket in the sprint. I wait on the developer, if he can get around to it, to create those scripts for me and allow me to help me to run my test. If I learn how to code or if I learn how to cook, I now take everything in my hands. I can make the meal exactly how I want, put the spices that I want. It's always hot, it's always exactly the way that I want, with some training. Learning how to code is exactly the same way. I had a guy on my team who didn't know anything about coding. He had to get out a critical customer issue. It was a complex regex that he had to test. And he had to create 500,000 documents on a Google Drive. So obviously it's not going to be able to be done by hand. It's a critical issue. So he took a little bit of time and research and found that with some very, very simple Python scripts and connecting to a Google API, he was able to do that himself. And so what he found was he became a more self-reliant tester. And that said, oh, it really opened the door for him because he was now able to say, I'm able to solve my own problems. And this is fantastic. It's a great feeling. So when we were talking with the team, learning how to code, it kept coming up of, it's very intimidating. I don't know what language to learn. I don't know, should I go to Udemy? Should I go to Stack Skills? Should I go to this place to learn all these types of technologies? And what I told him is said, hey, take a step back, take a step down. What we want is you need to learn how to read code output. You need to go in and take a look at the application that you're testing, whatever you're using, whether it's some sort of Kibana or something that you're able to look at your code, and run a test and look at what happens on the code output. Look and see what that result is. And what that allows them to do is allows them to create logic leaps to say, I perform this action and the code looks like it's doing this. Okay, cool. Now I'm starting to learn a little bit more about the internals of the code. Next is, once they get comfortable with that, we start teaching them how to read code. You don't have to know how to code to know how to read code. I was able to take my testers, show them some basic if-then-else logic, and they were able to say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Now they couldn't go out and they couldn't create classes or objects or methods or anything, but pretty much anyone can take a look at some code and say, hey, if a user does this or if they log in this, then this is the error message that I'm expecting. Cool, great. James Bach loves to do this. We got into a discussion with him, and he gave us a testing task as part of the discussion. And as part of the task, he gave us an application. He said, okay, I want you to go out and I want you to test this application, and whoever can find the most bugs in the next 10 minutes wins the apple off my desk, right? Prize wasn't really important, but it was finding those amount of bugs. And the person who won right-clicked on the application, viewed the source, and found all the error messages and the misspellings and the problems in the code. They were not a coder, but they were a tester. They used their logic brain. They used their skills to go in and say, hey, what happens if I do this? Oh, cool, look at this code. Oh, that looks funny, that's weird. Hey, James, what about this? This is weird. Hey, James, what about this? And he was able to say, yes, this is what I want you to know. This is what I want you to take out of this. And we were able to apply that to the rest of the team, and they were able to attend code reviews. And they were able to start learning, okay, hey, when they do this, hey, Mr. Developer, how come you didn't put a unit test here? Okay, you don't have a unit test here. That probably means that I need to go and then test this. And that starts getting back into that fail faster loop as well. And then the last thing here is pick a project. So one of the biggest things that I see failures of people who start and stop the coding type things is they don't have anything to apply it to. So they go out and they take a Python class or a Java class, but how is it relevant to what you're doing? Had a guy who loved beer. Most people love beer, right? We all were attending last night. We all love beer. So he had a major problem, not his drinking, but he had a major problem in that he couldn't keep track of all the beers that he was drinking. So maybe his drinking. So he created, based on the class that we were teaching the team how to code in Java, he created a beer rater for himself. So he went out and on his own, he's like, well, I'm gonna learn a little bit of HTML, I'm gonna learn a little bit of Java, I'm gonna learn a little bit of SQL so I can create my database, so I can hold my beer information in my database, and I have a little HTML page that I can enter my beer information in, and it connects to the database, and voila, hey, now you're a coding tester. But he was able to take all the complexities of all the classes and boil that down into something that was relevant for him. So picking a project is one of the #1 key skills. If you have testers out there or yourself are trying to learn, pick a project. Go out and learn some stuff and truly apply it to something. It will help you drive that learning. One of the biggest pieces here that is often also overlooked about DevOps is testing continuously. It's a phrase that is thrown around a lot, but a lot of folks really don't understand it. And what it truly does mean is you want to test at every single part of this process. You will notice that there also is a test here. That test is very important. One of the things that, again, is overlooked is things like exploratory testing, session-based testing, the ability to do some level of regression testing. So another thing I want to point out here is monitoring. If you're in QA and you're not paying attention to how your code works once it gets in production, you're missing half the story. If you don't know, when I make a deployment, that my support tickets have gone up, so there may be no bugs logged, but maybe you've increased the amount of support, or the product has increased the amount of support calls by 10x. Right? They may not be logging bugs on it, but have you made the product worse or better? Do you ever, as a QA person, when you go out, get a baseline of the number of error messages generated by day, by month, do a release, and do a comparison of those error messages? Again, there may be no true open defects there, but if you're generating 10x the number of error messages, we've probably in some way made the product worse. Taking a look at that monitoring and taking a look at the results of what I, as the QA person, is doing, not only does it help with that overall ownership, but it will help you get that full picture. Keith Lane was talking a little bit about that as well a while ago, is that story, right? How do you get that story? And this is a key piece to get that story. If you're not paying attention to what your users are doing or what the results are of the deployments that you have, you're missing a very key piece of that story. So how do I test continuously? Touched on this a second ago. If you go back and you look at some of the really old QA books from the late 80s, early 90s, one of the things they say in there is testers or QA members are not just responsible for testing the product. You are also responsible for the quality of the process. This is a huge piece that most testers and test managers forget. If a piece of the process is broken, it is up to the QA member to say, hey, this is broken, this communication is broken, or the length of time it takes us to get these user stories is broken, or when we do a deployment, it takes X amount of time, I believe we can shrink that. If you as a QA person are not taking a good hard look at the process that is being implemented, then again, you're missing a large portion of the story. Automating in Sprint. Again, Angie had touched on this a little while back yesterday. A key piece of this is integrating your automation team into your sprint teams. I have seen and worked with companies who they have an entire automation team that's over off to the side. They don't go to the sprint planning sessions. They're not actively involved. And what I found was, as the developers were writing unit tests, the testers were testing the same path that the unit tests tested, and the automation team was writing an exact same script that tested what the manual tester tested and what the unit test tested. Now, if you were trying to get your code out to production as quick as possible, that type of overlap is completely wasted time. You need to find that efficiency. You need to bring your teams in to help find that efficiency. Another thing with this is to make sure that you choose the right framework for your business. So a lot of folks say, hey, it's great, let's just do a page object model, that's amazing. But maybe it's not the best for your business. Maybe you need something more of a data-driven model. I was having the conversation with my friend Leslie yesterday a little bit about specification by example, where it works very, very well for a lot of companies, but maybe not necessarily very well for another company. I had a company I was talking with, and they, ERP company, and she was, the person in charge of the automation was essentially using page object model, trying to get all of the scripts organized. And what we found was that she had created 6,000 test cases that took 25 hours to run. She said, yeah, I run this every day. It's like, well, technically, it's like every day-ish. But what she really needed was something more of a data-driven design, to where she had all of these users that had all of these different flags. And I think when we looked at it, there was something like 20,000 different flags that needed to be set for various types of users. Well, if you put all that in, and you put that through the data, then that's going to really speed up your test. It's like, oh, okay, so I don't need to be just stuck on something that I read on Stack Overflow or something that is, cool, the new hotness. Pick something that makes sense for your organization. Explore more. We're at Quality Jam, so I'm definitely going to pump, Q Explorer, Q Test. If you're not using something to help track your exploratory testing, you're doing yourself a disservice. So use some level of tool so you don't have to go back 17 steps to figure out what you did, look at the screenshots. Definitely, if you haven't ever seen that tool, talk to the QA Symphony folks. It is an amazing, amazing tool. The other thing I see where teams fall flat on with exploratory testing is, all right, we're going to give testers an hour, now go do whatever you want. That's really ad hoc testing. That's not really exploratory testing. I recommend taking a look at session-based testing, if you're not familiar with that. Essentially, you create a charter to say, hey, we are concerned that we have a lack of testing in this area, or our code is spaghetti code, and we don't necessarily know where a defect might appear. So what we want to do is create a simple charter to say, hey, we're going to focus in this area. We're still going to give the testers the creativity, which is the main reason why folks want to do exploratory testing, is because your testers should be given some creative license to do tests that aren't driven by steps, because there's going to be some measure of your application that they did not know about when they wrote their test cases. That's why you even see some organizations say, before you write your test cases, do exploratory testing. Now, for some organizations that works well, some not necessarily so well. Don't tell James that I said that. But he is a big fan of, before you write your test cases, do your exploratory testing. Because how do you know what you're supposed to be writing your test cases for if you've never seen the application, if you've never seen the functionality? How do you know your test cases are right? So exploratory testing is something that is oftentimes overlooked and in the number one thing that is cut when going into DevOps. Because managers, executives don't see the value in exploratory testing. Oftentimes it's not tracked, it's not written down, the bugs aren't brought back to it. Folks don't really realize the true value being brought out of exploratory testing. So I encourage you to explore more. And the last part of testing continuously is I want you to break out of your old patterns. It used to be the day of, oh, we have to test in production. I'm really scared about that. It's really, really hard. Well, if it's hard and it's difficult, you should do it more often. Testing in production is one of the most valuable things that QA teams can do. I want you to do more production testing. And in fact, the companies that we see who are the most successful at continuous integration, continuous deployment, their manual testers only test in production. That's all they do. They only test in production. So they've got their own accounts, they use feature flags, canary testing, whatever it might be, but they have gotten rid of the staging environment. And a friend of mine always likes to say that staging should really be called a theory environment, because really your code's only working in theory. You don't really know it until you get to production. So the staging environment is that first thing that gets slashed. But to do this, you have to have automated tests that you trust. If you don't trust your automated test, it's really hard to get to this point. So the key thing that I want you to think about here is if something is painful, it probably means that you need to do it more often to get better at it, to really work at it. We're going to talk about what happens when your GUI disappears. Oftentimes, being in QA is much like Adventure Time as well. My daughter loves this show. So I want to talk a little bit about why GUI testing isn't the end-all, be-all answer. GUIs in themselves are typically fragile and brittle. They are the last thing to be typically developed, to be finished in a sprint, and they are the first thing typically to be changed by your product team. They love changing things on the GUI. When's the last time your product team came and said, you know what? That API, I don't really like the way that it's written, so we're going to change that API to make it look more beautiful. Right? The product team never really does that. They do that with the UI. So as a tester, you're really doing yourself a disservice if you're not learning how APIs and web services work. There's no reason as we move forward into this new world of new technologies and microservices and DevOps, that you can't take 30 minutes, 45 minutes and go onto YouTube, how do APIs work? There's great videos out there. And when you learn this, you can learn, I can be a more efficient tester. I can go and I can download this free tool, Postman. I can go and I can test my API directly. And I can make calls and I can figure out, hey, this isn't working. When I try to send some information over, that's breaking. So it allows you to be able to, as a tester, investigate better, which is a key skill. Because before, when you were reliant on the UI to do your testing is, I'm going to add something to a cart, I'm going to check out, oh, I've got some sort of failure. Okay, well, is it the UI? Is it the database? Is it the web service? Is it API? What is it? So now I can take a look, and I'm going to try that same thing. I'm going to fire up my SQL Workbench. I'm going to just try to put something right in the database. Okay, that works great. So now I'm going to go into Postman. I'm going to try to see if I can send some information over. That's not working. Oh, look, the API is down. So being able to know better how your application works and how to interact with your testing better, it can only benefit you. Embrace a new tool set. It is DevOps. I do have to say something about tools. Even though communication is the #1 thing about DevOps, tools is still important. One of the key things here I want folks to know is don't try to always reinvent the wheel. There was a good article that came out a little while back that was sent around of why are people still continually creating their own custom frameworks all the time? Now, some reasons, yes, it makes sense to create your own custom framework. But 90% of the time, you can probably go out there and find someone who already put the blood, sweat, and tears into trying to figure out the same problem, and they've created this nice tool, especially with the world of open source tools. And that's one thing that as I talk to testers, I said, hey, are you familiar with open source tools? How those work? Did you know that these tools are free? A light bulb goes off. They haven't even done their research. They haven't taken the time to go out and look and see what other tools are available. There's one that I like to talk about is locust.io. I was part of a migration project of moving a huge monolith application to a microservices-based application. And our regular load and performance testing just wouldn't cut it, because now we were looking at not just being able to drive all of our testing through the UI or all of our testing to that one application, but we had to test microservice communication to microservice communication. And we had no tool that was out of the box that we could figure out. So we went and did lots and lots of research, and we found this tool, an extremely lightweight tool. Our team had to learn some Python, which took about 15 minutes for the Java developers and Java testers. And we were able to, without having to create a custom solution, implement this very lightweight solution that someone had this same problem and went out and created this tool. It saved us a lot of time. So as a tester, you must continuously learn, you must continuously research and look for these new tools. You must look for these solutions. Most of the time, if you have a problem, someone else has had this same problem. The last thing here I'm going to talk about is building a stronger partnership with development. This is an absolute key tenet to DevOps and to automation and manual testing. You must find the efficiency between the tests that the developers are writing with their unit and integration tests, and the automated tests that the automated testers are writing with their automated tests. Sometimes they're writing integration tests as well. Because if you want to have a full test solution where your automated tests are reliable, maintainable, and relatable to what you're trying to test, you've got to have that partnership. You have to have that communication. And oftentimes in that where I see folks fail with a DevOps is there is that us versus them from the development side. We don't really need the developers to figure this solution out. But if you look, again, if we go all the way back to some of the key tenets of what DevOps is, it's about communication. And it's about building relationships and breaking down barriers. And the only way to truly break down the barrier in an organization is to have a strong relationship with your development team. From the manual testing side is manual testers must start to learn what unit tests are. They need to learn about TDD. They need to learn and understand, why is it important to me that a developer writes a unit test? What benefit do I get out of this? Why is this important that when I talk to the developer, I ask him, well, hey, what code here is unit tested? I'm not a believer that 100% of code needs to be unit tested. I don't think that that's a true reality for a lot of organizations. So what unit testing should do is it should give you some level of comfort. So that way I know where to focus my testing. And if you don't have that relationship with development, you'll never be able to figure that out. So last, we talk about testing continuously. As testers, you must learn continuously. If you're not taking the time every day, every week, to start learning some new skills, some new techniques, looking at the way things that people have done that have failed, things that people have done that have succeeded, you're doing yourself a great disservice, and you'll eventually become a dinosaur in the industry. I've seen it happen. I had a gentleman that I used to work for a long time ago who came and was looking for a job to work for me because he never grew. He thought he was comfortable in what he was doing because he was just a tester. He was a manual tester. He just loved doing what he was doing, but thought he was always going to be secure and that the world was not going to pass him by. The technology is growing. You're looking at things where testers now need to know about big data. They now need to know about DevOps. Possibly in the future, they need to know about AI. And as a tester, if you're not starting to branch into some of those fields, you will be bypassed. And otherwise, DevOps is great for testers. It's a good thing. Questions?
All right. Let me...
I knew you were going to have a question. There you go. Better be an easy question, otherwise no more rides to Sweetwater.
It's an easy question, Adam. You mentioned a tool for microservices testing, and what was the website for that?
Locust.io.
Locust with a T.
Yep, .io.
Like
the
insects.
bug. Essentially what it will do is it'll go out and it'll create swarms for load testing. So it's a very, very easy way to create a massive amount of load and be able to target that to individual microservices.
Great.
That was an easy question.
All right, one from PolEV. If you don't have dedicated testers for automation, are they the same people that are also doing the exploratory testing? And how do you add automation into the sprint in addition to your exploratory testing? So what's that balance?
So is the true question, what is the balance between automation and exploratory testing?
I think so.
So if you don't have automation testers?
Yep. If you don't have dedicated testers for automation.
Well, So if you don't have dedicated testers for automation and you're trying to do DevOps, you're probably going to fail, to be honest. To be completely honest, because you need to have a core automation solution. The only way to truly adopt a DevOps model where you're releasing multiple times per day, unless you have an army of testers that can test a massive amount of code, you have to have reliable automated tests that can run at each check-in, that the developers are running themselves, that are running as the build goes. Otherwise, your testers are going to be stuck having to do that level of testing. So if you're not in that situation, you should look to your developers to help write some of the automated testing. The downside of that is they're developers. They don't necessarily have a testing brain. They write their unit tests as developers. They don't write their unit tests as testers. So if you're in that situation, you must be a partner with development. You must say, hey, this is the way we need to write our unit test. This is the way we need to write our integration test. And then taking a look at that, I see the gap, and then I can run my exploratory testing or other testing within that gap. But if you don't have that partnership, you're just going to be shooting yourself in the foot.
This is an interesting question, and this is where this may turn into more of a support group. I recently learned that the dev lead in another group had instructed his devs not to talk to QA. He left the company recently, and the relationship is no longer toxic. I wondered how common this is among people here. So I think for you, do you see that with a lot of your customers, where this kind of toxic relationship, and if it is toxic, what do you do about it? What are some solutions other than hoping that the dev lead's going to leave the company?
So most of the time I see this, unfortunately, when I do see it, it's typically where automation testers are viewed as less than developers. Right? I think we all have probably kind of seen something like that. And a lot of times that really stems from the executive team or the management team doesn't truly understand the value of the automated testing. And the development team doesn't understand the value of the automated testing. And a lot of times that comes because of that lack of communication, because the automation testers are rarely invited to the sprint planning sessions. They sit off on their own, they do their own thing. They're always a sprint behind, so they're not necessarily relevant. So why should the developer at that point really care what they're doing? So that's why it's important to bring them up and have them more engaged into that conversation. And unfortunately, yeah, if you're in that toxic relationship, you should move out. I would definitely recommend having a conversation. If you're a manager, having a conversation with the individual developers and understand, and ask them, be honest, say, what value do you see in my automation team? What are they doing to help benefit you? Because oftentimes we're human beings, we're animals, mammals, most of us. That is what we really care about. What are you going to do for me? What benefit is this going to help for me? So you talk to them and say, hey, what benefit does the automation team have for you? And they may say, I have no idea what you guys do. Say, great, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what we can do. Did you know we can help alleviate some of your testing? Or we have this partnership where we can do this and we can whiteboard and we can be the SME for you. So it's really just open and honest communication.
Great. Is there another audience question?
So I'm just asking, for the DevOps, what kind of business you usually use? Because to me, my company, release every month is enough, not necessary to release every 2 or 3 times a day. So I just asking, what kind of business or organization want to release every 2 or 3 times a day?
What kind of business? So I know Amazon releases 24 times a day, not counting their products. But they make code changes in production about 24 times a day. I think Netflix is on the average of 16 times a day. Google is on the hundreds of times a day. They use a lot of canary testing, A/B testing. But even if you're in an organization that only releases to production once a month, continuous deployment is only a chunk of DevOps. You can still take and apply the continuous testing where you're running tests at every internal build, where you're taking a look at the monitoring, where you're taking a look at making sure that you've got efficiency between the manual testing and the automated testing. Because even if you're releasing once a month, I guarantee you, I can probably say with 90% accuracy that your testing team always feels squeezed. They always feel like they're out of time, right? Right. I mean, no matter how many times you're released, 6 months, every 6 months, whatever, your testing team is always the last to get squeezed. So if you can look and apply those fundamentals of failing fast Don't worry about the deployment part. Just worry about that initial part of looking at the requirements, getting more engaged and more involved, and building the stronger partnerships. It will definitely benefit your organization.
Hey, Adam.
Hi.
So one of the problems that I encounter on my sprint team is the developers are not always so proactive. So I try to integrate with them early, as you preach, so that's great. I feel like I'm doing the right things. However, sometimes it will get all the way through the lower environments up to QA, and there's still no unit test. So one of the things I did is introduce pair testing with them back in an integration environment. Do you have any other suggestions of ways that I could get more involved, because they don't have a unit test? They haven't done that. They haven't thought of that. I know nobody else has that problem. There's no testing before it gets to QA but me. But
we used to have that problem, and I was able to fight. I realize not everyone can do this, but I was able to fight to make QA the stage gates. QA was the only person that could push that button to build. They were it. So when the developers started realizing that they're held by their management team to get the right code out, but unless they partner with QA to make sure that it's tested and that code doesn't get out, they're not getting their job done, and their management team's not happy with them. So you have to make QA the stage gate. And that is something that classically used to be QA and has shifted to development and has kind of moved around, but something that should remain in QA is QA ultimately is responsible for the quality of the product. You know, if something gets to production and there's a big critical error, do they look at the development team and say, how dare you? No, they look at the QA team and say, how'd you miss this? So if that's the case, why isn't QA in charge of the releases? Why aren't they the stage gate? Right? They should be.
Everyone, one more time, Adam Satterfield.
Thank you.
Great job. Great job.